Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, if I described you to people who hadn't met you as being short, quite round, with long flowing blonde locks down to your knees, for those people, temporarily, that would be a fact.
Well, maybe. I could work on that if you like. So the long blowing hair. Yeah, look, it's interesting these days. We're becoming very, very aware of what facts and, or not facts are. And we're also getting a blurring these times of fiction. It's pretty much a time of now choose your own facts, really.
It is sad. This term of being a post-truth world disturbs me greatly.
Well, and this is what partly we're wanting to do in the theme of this episode. And this episode I've called Fact Today, Fiction Tomorrow. And so the reason is we have a guest coming up, and he's written a book on this. It's called The Half-Life of Facts. And this is actually looking now, everyone who's professional these days will have learnt a lot through university. As they get out, they might learn that what they've learned is either not correct or sometimes been superseded or sometimes just completely doesn't work.
Yep.
And this is the evolution in medicine. This is absolutely true. People talk about we have a foundation of knowledge. But not only that, you have to get up to speed with knowing what everyone knows in that field today. And then you have to keep abreast of all the information that's coming out. And that's really hard. And look, it's interesting to think, are we coming to the limitations of human knowledge? Meaning that it took me about a decade to get up to speed with what we know in medicine. And that's just the foundation. That's not knowing specifics. And then to say in each field, you take about 10, 15 years and a person will be considered an expert and still has to continually read journals to keep up to speed. It is a real challenge.
I imagine for GPs especially, if only there was a podcast they could listen to.
Well, let's see. Let's keep our fingers crossed that something comes along. But the whole point behind that, and this is a challenge for generalists, is that what do you keep abreast of? What's the information? And so it's always going to be a challenge, and it's only going to get harder. And so I wanted to discuss about facts, about what we're learning, about understanding the nature of information, how it changes over. And that's what this episode's about. And this first part is actually demonstrating 3 different stories sometimes about information. 1, just being wrong. 2, about the treatment works, but our understanding behind it is probably erroneous. And then another one, the third one, is just the way we learn, how we actually just understand this evolution of knowledge. And so the first is actually about milk transfusions. And this was happening in the late 1800s. The milk transfusion period is considered between 1873 and 1880s. Now, this is when doctors were treating/experimenting on patients who had severe anemia. And so when you think about a milk transfusion, we're not talking about going to your fridge, opening up and taking it. We're talking about milk. And there was either milk from cows or goats, where you would actually get milk and then you would transfuse it into a patient. Now, there is clearly significant adverse events in this, as we will show in some of the parts coming up. But this was interpreted with varying levels of success. And some of these were reported in the British Medical Journal. There's one doctor who wrote about this. His name was Dr. W. Pepper. And he had 2 patients who he gave milk transfusions to and recorded their findings. And his first patient was a 32-year-old woman who he'd diagnosed with extreme anemia and intense spinal irritability. And so it's not
spinal irritability?
One of those diagnoses. But the following was described.
As soon as the milk began to enter the vein, there appeared violent capillary congestion of the face and surface of the body. The eyes were injected and prominent, the lips turgid, the whole expression wild and alarming. The respiration was laboured, and an intense sense of oppression was felt, the patient clutching at the throat in her distress. While these symptoms were so severe, the flow of milk arrested for a few seconds when, as she became easier, it resumed. 18 minutes after the operation, there was an outbreak of urticaria, the wheals being large and pale reddish. The operation was repeated on June 27th and again on July 17th. Nearly the same symptoms appear as at the first operation, with the addition of great headache, nausea and vomiting, pains and cramps about the pelvic viscera, and on the last occasion, premature appearance of catamenia, menstrual bleeding.
And Dr. Pepper's conclusion?
It would appear that in the case of long-standing anemia, not connected with organic disease, milk transfusion thrice repeated was certainly productive of benefit. The symptoms the attending the operation were severe, but were probably aggravated by the nervous condition of the patient.
And so that's probably a very paternalistic approach to...
Yes, you don't say.
And so that conclusion is staggering. And
to say the least.
The comments he makes before his conclusion is that afterwards the patient seemed to be calmer, seemed to have more energy.
They survived an ordeal.
and it's just glossed over there, but this was repeated when they said thrice. So they did this 3 times, and that reaction was the first reaction. And so they still persisted. Now, we would see this as quite a severe allergic reaction that's going on, but effectively what you're doing is injecting full milk straight into someone's vein. And you are getting a reaction. But this was not once off. There was a second patient who was a 33-year-old English sailor who had progressive anemia, and he had other symptoms such as a bronzing face, muscular disability or debility. He had palpitations, occasional attacks of vomiting. Now, he was also treated with milk transfusions.
6 ounces of milk were allowed to flow into the left median basilic vein. The first effect was marked flushing of the face, with a feeling as though the head would burst. The stomach rejected its contents, and there was a strong desire to defecate. The following day the patient slept well and felt stronger. For a few days he seemed stronger and was able to walk about.
So they did this another 2 times.
June 27th, a week after the second operation, 6 ounces of milk were injected into the median cephalic vein. The usual train of symptoms followed, and there was a decided chill lasting 25 minutes, for about 15 of which he was perfectly blind, not being able to distinguish the slightest object. The blindness disappeared with the chill.
And so they see this as successful. As you just saw, he would describe it as the patient's symptoms afterwards improved. So this was seen clearly as a transitory reaction.
This is staggering. I was banging him with the hammer and he hurt, and I stopped, and suddenly the pain went away.
Amazing, it did, yeah. And this extended. This is almost a decade of experimentation of milk and people trialing this stuff. Now, clearly we can see what is wrong with this at the time. We know this is a large reaction. This would have caused huge problems, and as you can see, eventually it was stopped. And in 1884, the saline was developed as a blood transfusion or an infusion alternative. And It wasn't until 1900 that we found out there was blood groups, which was called ABC. Later, C changed to O, and then they found AB. And so those blood groups have persisted for a long time, but that paved the way for blood transfusions to occur. But blood transfusions were being trialled with animals, directly into the veins because you had no way to preserve it. And so you can see here, this is where information was completely wrong, but they persisted anyway for a long span.
Are we living in the best time of medical history, or is something like this happening to us today?
Oh, I think there is. My personal perspective is one day we'll look back at cancer therapy and actually go, my goodness, all they did was kill dividing cells. And that will be seen as barbaric, but that's unfortunately the best option. We're moving towards targeted therapy now, but we're still a while away from that being widespread with the vast majority of cancers. But that's one area where we got it wrong. And unfortunately, as this podcast is dedicated to show, we get it wrong a lot, but we do learn. And so this next one is we've talked about before. This is a story I really quite find fascinating. And this is the story of Julius Wagner-Jauregg. We talked about him. And he was treating a condition called dementia paralytica. Now, he was born in the mid-19th century. He had a friend who was Freud at the time. Now, he had no training in psychology or neurology, but went into psychology and neurology. He was a doctor, therefore he could go into any areas of those times. And this was when in 1883, he was a quote-unquote psychiatrist going around the ward, and he saw a woman, a female patient who had severe psychosis, and she got a skin infection. So this was the erysipelas, so a skin strep infection.
Yeah. And
she got a really high fever. Now, she was suffering from dementia at the time, but after her skin infection, which she got quite a good going fever and was unwell, her psychosis resolved.
Oh.
And she was cured. And he looked at this and thought, well, dementia this dementia, this psychosis this patient had, must have a biological basis. And so he started to going and experimenting and say, well, maybe if I give all the patients with dementia or this psychosis a skin infection, their fever will resolve their dementia, their psychosis.
Wow.
And so he set to do that. But unfortunately, he tried to give them the same skin infection, so a strep infection of the skin, but it wasn't reliable. You couldn't get a persistent skin infection to give these patients a good enough fever.
How disappointing.
And then, so this was the time when tuberculin was produced. So this is for TB injections, so which would give you a fever if you had the injection. The problem with that is not in his experiments, but patients had died from receiving that injection. So he moved away from that. And so it wasn't until around the 1917 that the perfect agent came across. And so this was 1917. This was people when were coming back from the war. And so what were they coming back from the war with? Well, they had malaria. And so he had these patients who he would actually take the blood from returning soldiers, have malaria, and inject malaria into patients who had this dementia paralytica.
Oh, that's much better.
And so this is using a disease to treat a disease. And guess what? Malaria is excellent at producing fever. In fact, it produces cyclic fevers.
Oh.
And so they had a wonderful treatment there called quinine.
Yes.
And then you would actually treat them afterwards. So then you would give them a disease to treat their disease, and then you treat the disease that treated the disease.
What are the Medicare numbers? They would stack up, wouldn't they?
And so, but it worked. And a lot of these patients actually resolved their quote-unquote dementia paralytica. Now, he was thinking, okay, it was to the point of he ended up receiving the Nobel Prize in 1927 for this treatment. Now, what was he actually treating? He was treating tertiary syphilis. He just didn't know it at the time. And so the amount of people diagnosed up until 1945 with this neurosyphilis was about 5 to 10% of psychiatric admissions at that time. And so that's a huge swath. There were thousands of people that were treated. He didn't know that's what he was treating. And in around the 1940s, you get penicillin, which is a better treatment, but they used to call this pyrotherapy. And so you treated that. Now, is he wrong to have treated them with the wrong? Now, the treatment worked, but
I don't think a fair-minded person would say he was wrong.
Well, and that's the hard thing. He received the highest award that you can. And again, this was one of those stories that you're like, okay, well, he treated it and he treated it effectively. His thinking was wrong,
yes.
But this is the evolution of understanding and knowledge in that area.
The Mr. Magoo protocol. He gets through safely and no one has any idea how the heck he did it.
And then this brings us to the third story. And the third story is actually from 1846, and this is Ignaz Semmelweis. Now, he's a Hungarian doctor. Now, he was starting in a maternity clinic, General Hospital in Vienna. And this is the New Age. Again, a lot of these stories come from the 1800s. There's a reason they come from 1800s. This is the learning time, the understanding, where we actually change probably the infancy of critical thinking, of evidence-based to a point. But this was the new age of science and study and also of autopsies. And so they were now being seen as a very useful educational tool for doctors and medical students to understand anatomy, and physiology was becoming understood more, but certainly nowhere near what it is today. But this is how they learnt, through mainly anatomy. Now, this is very hazardous. Remember, the germ theory wasn't discovered until 1884. So when we're looking at this is several decades in between this. So Semmelweis is there, and conducting autopsies had risks. But he is now at a maternity clinic, and there's two different wards. One is the ward with doctors and medical students. It's all male. And he noticed there was an increase in puerperal fever, which is known as childbed fever. So women who would come in and have their children, there was an increased risk of getting this quote-unquote childbed fever. And unfortunately, often it was fatal. And so he then looked at a different ward, and there was a maternity ward run by all women midwives. And he started looking at this because they had a significant lower rate of this childbed fever. In fact, when he did the statistics, the all-male doctor ward had 5 times the death rate of women from childbed fever. Now, there was different theories that he approached to this. He thought, okay, well, let's look at the way the women are birthing. And the midwives had the women on their side giving birth. So then he went to the doctors and said, well, let's, instead of having women on their back, put them on their side. Mm-hmm. Problem is, that didn't change anything. So his second theory was every time someone died from childbed fever in the doctor's ward, there would be a priest with an attendant who would walk past ringing a bell. Mm-hmm. And he thought, well, that must terrify the women. And that possibly could be the reason behind they're terrified, they're more anxious, and that will be the reason. So he stopped the bell ringing, but that had no effect. Now, Semmelweis got pretty frustrated at this point in time. He took a break, and he had, during this break, one of his colleagues back at work was conducting an autopsy and cut his finger. And then he became unwell from this injury and ended up dying. Now, when Semmelweis got back, he was notified about his colleague's death. And when he inquired a little bit more, he found out that his colleague had died from the same symptoms of childbed fever.
Ah.
And he realized that maybe there's a link. And so when he started looking at it, he went to the doctors and looked at the procedures about what was happening. What was happening on the doctor's ward was that doctors and medical students would go into the morgue, conduct an autopsy, and then from there go directly to the maternity ward and deliver babies. And so what he saw was there must be some particles or some parts that are being transferred from corpses to the women.
Yes.
And this is making the women sick. And so he instituted a part of hand washing, of cleaning with chlorinated subjects, which then reduced the level of childbed fever in the doctors.
At last.
At last. The problem is Semmelweis was an incredibly poor communicator and effectively accused the doctors of, well, they took it as being accused that they were killing their patients. So he ended up being ostracized and no one listening to that advice. And it's not until well after his death that they realized he had been right.
So they washed their hands of him.
Well, exactly. And of nothing else. And this is kind of a tragic story, but one of the information of how we learn. And this is also an interesting case because the way we learn often is actually sometimes ideas are not always met with as much enthusiasm as you might think. And so sometimes there is a sort of almost a friction of getting people to understand that there is some value in this information. It's not the easiest thing, but look, those three stories shows how our understanding can change, how our knowledge can change. This is where I was wanting to go with facts about our understanding.
Well, you've whetted my appetite. Let's arrange to get our guest on the program. Sam Arbesman is a scientist and author, including journal articles for the Cabinet of Wonders, The Atlantic, Wired, BBC and Harvard Business Review, as well as 2 books, and working on his third. The first book, Overcomplicated, Technology at the Limits of Comprehension, and of particular interest to us today, The Half-Life of Facts, Why Everything We Know Has an Expiration Date. Samuel's a scientist in residence at Lux Capital and also a senior fellow of the Silicon Flatiron Center for Law, Technology and Entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado Boulder and research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. Today, Samuel's our guest on This Medical Life podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be chatting with you.
We're looking forward to this too. Now, you've literally written the book on the half-life of facts and the fluidity of knowledge. What's the shelf life of your book?
Well, that is a good question. I'm pretty sure between the time I sent the book to the printers and the book was published, I learned a certain amount of information that actually overturned certain things in the hardcover, and then we were eventually able to change it in the paperback and include it afterward. But yeah, it's the delightful part of writing this book was, and I got to revel in the fact that things were outdated and we learned new things, I could change stuff. But yeah, I would say I think the overall ideas have a long shelf life. Perhaps the individual details do not, which is simply just I guess it reinforces the overall message of the book.
And what started you on this pathway? Was it the scientist part of you or the author part of you or some combination therein?
That's a great question. So I would say it definitely came from the world of science, although I'm not exactly sure, but I would say one impact was, so I come from the world of complexity science and kind of network science, kind of understanding how big complex systems change over time, or just kind of the various behaviors and phenomena within large complex systems, whether or not it's in biology, it could be in technological systems, it could also be in social systems, like how cities grow and change, things like that. And the truth is, certainly one way I got involved in that was probably actually reading the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov many, many years ago. And because within it, there's this whole field, this fictional field of psychohistory, which is using math to understand kind of the regularities behind how societies grow and change and how history kind of unfurls. And so I was very interested in kind of understanding that. I'm not sure that was the only factor in me getting into this field, but that was certainly what got me into complexity science. And then I began discovering that there was this field of research around quantifying how knowledge grows and changes. And then I just realized that there's a lot here. It's a very meaty topic. And I was super excited by it.
Now, can I ask, you use half-lives, traditionally used with radioactive material. How do we apply this to facts, really?
No, it's great. Yeah. And so the way to think about it, and it's certainly metaphorical, sometimes like a little bit more quantitatively similar. But the idea behind it is so like the half-life is related to radioactive materials, as you mentioned. So I can't predict if you give me like an atom of uranium, for example, I can't predict when that atom is going to decay. It could be in the next fraction of a second. It could be millions of years. The difference, though, is that things change when you get a whole bunch of atoms of uranium together. When you have like a whole chunk of uranium, suddenly the individual like, unpredictable things actually become quite regular. You can actually say, okay, I know, like you can trace out this nice little curve and say, I know how long it'll take for half of the atoms within this chunk of uranium to decay. I can't predict which specific half it's going to be. So there is a certain amount of uncertainty and unpredictability, but I do know overall kind of the shape of this kind of decay. And the idea is that the same kind of thing is true with knowledge. I might not be able to predict which specific facts are going to be overturned or which discoveries are going to be made, but there are regularities and rules to how knowledge grows and changes over time. And sometimes even how things like how knowledge in specific fields decays over time, hence the kind of half-life of fact.
That part, which you cover very early on in this book, fascinated me because I am not a physicist. I'm not involved in that. And I just assumed the half-life of, say, a radioactive material is every single particle has that half-life. And really it's referring to the sum of the whole, that on average, half of them will have been affected over that time. With the half-life of something, it's not at a particular particle level, it's the overall. And I'd never thought about it in that way. It seems less exact than I had imagined it was in my plebeian understanding.
Yeah, and it's certainly it's less exact. I mean, I would say it's exact in the sense that, and you're not dealing with like, when you have a chunk of uranium, you're not dealing with 5 atoms or 10. You're dealing with some number with many zeros after it. So I don't even know what the prefix would be for that number of atoms. And so and the thing there is that at that point, statistics really becomes these kind of like very clear, concrete rules. And so there is a great deal of power in that. The idea that like once you have a certain amount of information or you're kind of aggregating things together, then suddenly, things go from unpredictable to actually quite regular. And it's because these like law of large numbers or whatever the kind of the requisite statistical law is there.
Well, the analysis worked really well for me from a pathology perspective because we look at things in a macroscopic and microscopic level. And so this is where we were looking at, if you look almost at the cellular level, I could tell you that a bunch of them are going to die just through normal processes, but the overall is different. It's sort of, I can't tell you which one, but I know overall this will eventually happen. So I sort of look at it there's a macroscopic and microeconomic level. There's a macro and microscopic micro level. Exactly. This was sort of we can't tell you what facts are going to change, but we know some of them are going to change. It's sort of, but I think that's where you're saying that lay people, you see it almost as lying and see, well, you told me the truth.
Yeah, right. Like there's kind of this aggregate understanding of knowledge. And you're right. Like the fact that we don't know which things are going to be overturned, or we said, oh, like this thing was true now, and now this thing is not true. Like, how can you be certain of everything? And of course, that's not really how it works. The idea is that like science is this kind of like continuing process of learning new things. And I think this kind of feeling of like, oh my God, everything's changing is actually exacerbated by the fact that oftentimes the facts that we're confronted with, especially when it comes to like new medical knowledge, it's often the new discoveries, and the new discoveries are where we know the least as scientists and just kind of as a society, which means at the frontier of knowledge, when we know the least, that's where all the flux is going to be happening. And so we thought maybe this was true, and thought this food is healthy, and now it's actually unhealthy, or whatever it is. I think as long as you just kind of see all of that flux, it can be very overwhelming without realizing, wait a second, like you might just be kind of selecting for the most uncertain things. But in addition, even though there is all this flux, there are these regularities, and it's kind of hard mentally to kind of take a step back if we're just kind of constantly confronted with, oh, like we thought this was true and therefore we think it's wrong, and like now we know nothing. And of course, that's not really how it is. And actually, going back to Isaac Asimov, there's this quote that I love that I included in the book, where he received some letter from someone about, so it was someone saying like, oh, we thought the Earth was flat. That's wrong. And we thought the Earth was a perfect sphere. That's also wrong because it's actually this oblate spheroid. So therefore, how can we know anything? And Asimov's response was like, if you think that thinking the Earth is flat is just as wrong as thinking the Earth is a perfect sphere, then your view is wronger than both of them put together. And like, there's a kind of this understanding that like asymptotically we are approaching the truth, at least I hope. But along the way, there's going to be a lot of change, and it's kind of, and if we only focus on these oscillations without realizing that we're kind of getting towards, we're hopefully ratcheting towards something which approaches our true understanding of reality. If you only see the flux, then yeah, you're not going to realize kind of what's happening underneath.
Now, there is a book published in 1963, which you mentioned. It's called It's called Little Science, Big Science, and this was by Derek D. Solaire Price. Now, they measured double time of knowledge in different fields, and they said medicine doubling time was 87 years, and scientific journals were about 15 years. Asteroid detection, just to throw some science in there, was 10 years. Now, that I'm trying to work out, is that short? Is that long? But are these figures stable, or have they been revisited? Do we know?
That's a great question. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure. I would assume, like, it depends how you measure kind of like doubling time of knowledge. So if it's like simply just the number of papers or things like that, I imagine the doubling time has shortened just because of the sheer number of people who have gone into these fields. That being said, that there are many other ways of measuring these kinds of things, and as the difficulty of discovery or advancement becomes harder, as the difficulty increases, then things will slow down. So it could be the kind of thing where maybe the doubling time went down and then is now going back up again. So that's a really good question. I don't actually know the answer, but it's it would show a number of interesting things around like ages of fields, the number of scientists who are kind of getting into certain domains, things like that.
Now, can I ask you? You mentioned this word. I don't know if you made it up. I don't think you did. I think it was called Scientometrics. Can you tell us what Scientometrics is?
Sure. So scientific, it is not my term. It is a real term. It is basically just the kind of like measurement of science, the quantitative study of science. And I think nowadays there's a number of people who talk about the science of science, or they talk about meta science, kind of trying to understand how science progresses. Some of these kind of quantitative measures actually come out of the field of like information science or even library science, because there was a real need for understanding the ways in which science progressed. And especially within libraries, there was a need for understanding the ways in which the number of journal articles was increasing, because prior to digitization, there was a very real concern of, okay, how many journals can we keep on the shelves, or how many books should we be keeping on the shelves as all these things continue to grow? And then the question became, okay, when do we like take things off the shelves? When do we kind of stop adding things, or kind of take certain books or journals out of circulation because they're no longer being used? And as a result of that, my sense is that people began to actually quantitatively measure how long it took for people to stop citing certain papers, or how often people were actually taking books out of the library. I don't actually know the details of those kinds of things, but there was this really clear need for understanding this. And then related to that, there was also just understanding how science operated, whether or not the power of particle accelerators was developing according to certain regularities. And if so, how did that affect discoveries? So yeah, Scientometrics kind of examines all these different things.
Mm-hmm. And there was an addition to that, there was Eurekametrics. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So that term is made up, or in the sense that every term is made up. So Eurekametrics, it came out of a paper from me and my postdoc advisor, Nicholas Christakis, and we were looking at, in this case, specifically quantifying discovery. And so like Eureka is like the thing that Archimedes said when he made a discovery. So we thought, okay, Eurekametrics related to discovery. And so this was kind of quantifying the rate at which discoveries are made in different fields and trying to understand the reason why those rates are different, and trying to kind of understand it quantitatively.
So using these two theories, can we predict the likelihood of timing for future medical discoveries?
So potentially, going back to the whole idea of like aggregating everything together. If you have a specific discovery or an idea, it would need to be kind of placed within some larger context of other similar discoveries or other advances that maybe are leading towards that specific discovery. Because otherwise, it's very, very hard to kind of understand oh, when will this discovery be made? But if that discovery is part of some larger process or phenomenon, and then and there's kind of some regularity there, then you can predict it. So it really kind of depends on the specific situation. I imagine if you like, and if the question is like, when will there be like widespread human cloning or something like that? Like, I don't know. There might actually. That being said, there might be some way of trying to quantify that and regularize it and say, okay, we know certain things around certain mammalian species and certain things around how society kind of adopts certain advances, and then maybe you can. And now I'm just making this up as we chat, but like there might be a way of kind of putting it within some sort of quantitative framework to give us a sense. And of course, also you'd want to have like a certain amount of error bars and things like that. But I think as long as you can kind of put a discovery within some larger quantitative context and framework, you might be able to actually build some sort of predictive model.
And I would hope it would include an allowance for the Netflix effect, because I've just finished listening to Bill Bryson's The Short History of Nearly Everything, which is a wonderful tour de force through the history of discovery. And one thing that came through is just about all those eureka moments came from someone who idly of an evening or a weekend would put their passion into meticulously getting to the bottom of something that could take years, whereas now people just tune out to Netflix and it soaks up so much time that could be diverted to the human endeavor. That makes me perhaps jaundiced on my view of the pace of these eureka moments. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's interesting. There definitely is research about whether or not discoveries and advances are slowing down. I'm not necessarily sure it's been correlated to people kind of using their spare time in different ways. It's more often related to the fact that as fields become more and more developed, that like the low-hanging fruit of discovery has all been picked. And so therefore it becomes either more resource intensive or more difficult. There's also people who have been talking about just the fact that as a field becomes more developed, you just have to know more to kind of get to the frontier of knowledge. And so there's a paper with a term like I think it was the burden of knowledge and like the death of the Renaissance man. And this idea that like as you need to learn more and more to kind of get to the frontier to make discoveries, it becomes harder and harder, and you have to study longer and longer. And at a certain point, maybe you're going to bump up against the mental ability, like how much you can actually hold in your brain. I'm not quite sure we've bumped up against that yet, at least in terms of certain discoveries. That being said, my other book, Overcomplicated, was about like building systems that no one can kind of keep entirely within their head. And so I'm very interested in kind of epistemic limits. But I definitely think there definitely seems to be evidence for discovery slowing down in certain fields, or maybe they're continuing to move, but maybe it's like the pace of discovery is linear, and it's kind of it requires more resources and it's more difficult, but it's counteracted by the fact that more resources are being poured in, more scientists are working on these things, and so you might expect an exponential growth, but it's actually kind of becoming more linear. Hopefully you're kind of getting out of this like slowdown. I don't know. But there is a decent amount of research about that. But I have not seen anything about how people use their time, which is kind of interesting to see.
Can I ask then, because you do describe the information curve as exponential, are we at the point where we're at saturation level anywhere? Because all I can use was medicine as an example, that it will take about 10, 15, maybe even 20 years for someone to become an absolute expert in their field. And they're still having to learn, they're still having to really push to keep up to journals. And honestly, a lot of people end up retiring because they just can't keep up. I don't know if there's an example or anything of almost that exponential curve just flattening out.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I definitely know there's what is it, the Eroom's law in terms of pharmaceuticals, like the idea that kind of like the opposite of Moore's law, that it like requires more and more resources, like the kind of like exponential growth and like money poured into to make to develop pharmaceuticals. However, I would say the way I kind of think about it, and oftentimes, and when you see kind of exponential growth, sometimes underlying it, there's kind of like a series of like other exponentials. And I would say, or kind of like these like sigmoidal curves where something kind of stagnates, and there's another one that kind of takes the place of it. And so my hope is that we are not yet at kind of saturation points because of certain advances. And it could be certain technological advances where maybe it's easier now to search the scientific literature, or maybe with certain things around large language models and AI, it can be easier to kind of help tie papers together. And people have been thinking about these kinds of things like since the 80s around like finding ways of connecting different papers and kind of uncovering different like hidden knowledge and kind of connecting things together. And so my hope is that kind of anytime we're kind of getting towards one of these saturation points, kind of like the flat part of like some sort of S curve, there will be some sort of advance that will hopefully allow us to kind of continue on the exponential. But we might eventually run out of them. I don't know. So it's I am hopeful, but realistic.
The other thing that I wanted to mention about you talk about facts spreading. You talk about network science and social interactions. Can you tell us a little bit more about how facts actually spread, which is pretty pertinent to these days?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so when I was writing about social networks, I was thinking not just about like online social networks like Facebook and Twitter and things like that, but also just the network of connections that people have. And there is a large amount of research around understanding the social ties between people, like both the strength of the ties, like for example, like your best friend or your spouse is a much stronger tie than someone you just chatted with briefly on an airplane. And so there's a strength of tie, but you can actually map out the entire social network of a population. Sometimes you could even do it globally. And now we actually have data to allow that kind of thing. And so there's like kind of the idea of like the 6 degrees of separation, but we now probably know it's might actually be closer to 4. That you can kind of like there's like 4 actually no, that might be right. I'm not exactly. It's been a little while. I'm not sure if that's correct. I think we have about 4 close social ties on average, and people have done this. I think there's like the General Social Survey, like a number of different surveys to kind of understand strength of ties. But the idea behind this is that if you can map out the structure and strength of social ties, you can then begin to see how various things on top of the network spread. And it can be diseases, which obviously is very relevant as people are thinking about like pandemics and COVID, but also information, because information also spreads. And it spreads in sometimes similar ways to the way disease spreads, but sometimes it also spreads differently. Like it might be that you might need to hear a bit of information 2 or 3 times before you are willing to spread that bit of information, versus with a virus, you only need to receive that virus once before your body says, okay, I'm ready to spread it to other people. There's differences in kind of details there. That being said, one of the things that people studied was trying to understand the strength of ties and how the strength of ties has an impact on information spreading. And for what I remember, the idea is like medium strength ties are actually most important for spreading knowledge and information. And the reason behind that is because very weak ties, they might be helpful for, I don't know, getting a job or kind of getting a foot in the door for getting a job, but you're not necessarily going to be spending a lot of time talking to these people. On the other hand, very strong ties, oftentimes they already know all the same things you know. You're kind of in this kind of like tight-knit network. And so you kind of need these medium strength ties that are able to bridge different communities. And so they are the ones that are actually most likely to spread information. And so I think that would be at least one detail in terms of understanding how knowledge and facts spread. But there's many other studies that have been done as well.
Now, there was a study published in 2018 by MIT, and it talked about social media, that lies actually propagate about 10 to 20 times faster than facts. But does this break the sort of network science, sort of networks model?
I don't think so. I would say it's the kind of thing where, you could have a very simple model to understand kind of how information spreads, but I think we're probably beginning to realize the ways in which different, like the content of the information also affects the way in which things spreads. And so in the same way that different viruses have different kind of R naughts in terms of like their spreadability, presumably different bits of information will also have kind of a different R naught. Now, and unfortunately, it is unfortunate to hear that false information has a much higher kind of like spreadability value than true information. It could also, maybe it's also like the way in which things are packaged, and if it's like more alarmist, then people are more likely to spread it. I don't know, but I think understanding kind of the valence and the content of the information, kind of like the way like the aesthetics of the information, I think that's also a really important thing, kind of to understand how it moves about on the structure of the network.
Wow. Samuel, as we strive to move our relationship from a weak one to a medium one, let's take a breather. We'll be back in just a moment to focus on your book and particularly the medical themes that are carried throughout. Samuel, let's continue our conversation now, and I'd like to turn to your book. There was certainly a strong medical theme throughout it. I just wonder, was that intentional, or did that just happen with the examples that you had to work with?
That's a great question. I would say, certainly medicine is one area that really has to contend with changing knowledge because, you have to confront fully the fact that if my information is not up to date, people's lives are on the line, and I really have to kind of get this kind of thing right. But I would say it also is probably personal to a certain degree, in the sense that while I am not a physician or kind of come from the medical field, a lot of my family does, and so I have examples from my father and my grandfather. So my grandfather, he was a dentist, and then he was a retired dentist. He and he had all these different stories about different all his medical experience. But I would say one interesting thing was when he told me, he might even just mention in passing the fact that he learned the wrong number of human chromosomes when he was in school. And I was kind of flabbergasted, and I began doing some digging, and it turned out there was this several decade period where we were able to image the interior of a cell, but not that well. And so people counted, and I guess they counted 48 chromosomes instead of 46, and it got into the textbooks. And it happened to be that my grandfather went to dental school during the time that was in the textbook. And I think in the mid 50s, it was eventually, they had some better imaging technique, and then it was eventually corrected. But that fact really stuck with me, coupled with the fact that I believe it was my father who told me this example. And I think I include this in the book, where he was told by one of his professors. My father is a retired dermatologist, and that one of his professors gave some exam, and there was one question. It was a multiple choice question where it was the exact same thing from one year to the next. And one year, one of the choices was correct, and the next year another choice was correct. And just these kind of this I don't know if it was a steady drumbeat of examples, but enough examples kind of built up. I was there is something interesting going on in medicine, and I began to kind of focus more and more on that as well.
So you didn't decide to go in the family business of medicine, went to science. Are you the black sheep of the family?
Probably. So my brother is also a dermatologist. I would say so. Yeah. So I'm kind of the lead, and my mother. So she has a PhD like me, but she's an injury epidemiologist. So she actually still studies biomedical kinds of things. She also has an occupational therapy degree. Yeah. So I'm very much the least medical in the family. I find it interesting, but maybe from a certain distance.
Now, there was a mention where a study was done in Paris in a hospital about how quickly facts were superseded, and they became out of date. And the area that they were studying was liver disease, namely cirrhosis and hepatitis. Can you tell us a little bit more about the findings for that?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting paper where they wanted to understand the rate at which knowledge was being overturned. And so basically what they did was they took papers over the course of 50 years or so, and gave them to experts. And they said, okay, based on the titles of the abstracts or some information about them, let us know if these papers are still up to date, if they've been rendered obsolete by new techniques or kind of otherwise inaccurate. And then based on that, they just began to kind of aggregate all this information and trace out a curve of how long it took for information to be overturned. And then based on that, they said, oh, looks like it takes about 45 years for half of the knowledge to be rendered obsolete and overturned. And so they had this paper about the half-life of knowledge. And it was just a striking discovery to kind of see that within a human lifetime, half of what you might have learned in that field is completely obsolete. And of course, there are many other examples where I think it's a lot of professors in medical schools will say within 5 years of your graduation, half of what you know will be wrong, and so I think over and over within this is kind of hammered home that a lot of what you know might not be correct anymore. But it was intriguing to see someone study this so quantitatively.
Now, this was also applied. There was using citations as measures of truth, so to speak, of journals and assessing their half-life. Did you come across some of the half-lives of different medical journals?
So I don't remember the exact numbers. If you have any of those handy, that'd be very interesting. I definitely remember. I don't know if it was specific journals, but I feel in different fields, people had studied kind of the half-life. Now, of course, and the interesting thing with using citation is a very easy metric because you can kind of just very quantitatively understand that. by downloading information, but it's a very rough proxy. And I kind of want to be very upfront about that. Like, just because a paper is not being cited anymore doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong, or it could just be that it's kind of become part of. There's many. It could become part of kind of the general knowledge, and so people don't cite it anymore. So, for example, like Newton's Principia. And maybe it's been superseded by Einsteinian mechanics, but at the same time, though, it's still pretty relevant. But no one really cites Newton when they're writing a physics paper, because it's kind of part of like the water in which physicists swim. On the other hand, though, there are many papers that are still cited, but they're not actually cited because they're relevant. It might be cited because you're saying, here's a paper that is totally wrong and I disagree with it. And so it still gets a citation even though they disagree with it. So so you can definitely use it as like a rough and ready measure, like kind of a rough and approximate measure. But I would kind of say you always have to dig in to kind of understand a little bit more of what's going on there.
Yeah, no, I was reading it, and it was somewhere between the journal articles were between probably about 5 to 10 years of the citations were sort of turned over, which for me was sort of unsettling to believe that you would pretty much have to read, if you look at it over 10 to 20 years, and most of the citations back then would then be out of use for the majority of them, which always unsettling. But look, there were three. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say it's also partly because like there's like a recency bias. Like scientists always love thinking about like things that are newest, which can be very good. But at the same time, though, there is still value in kind of like digging in the archives, and I think kind of like looking in like the older things.
Yeah. Now, there are 3 specific stories that I just wanted to raise with you. One was the Raynaud's disease with fish oil. There was ALS, which is amyotrophic laterosclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and the skin biopsy linkage, which I think might have been associated with your father. And there was streptokinase and cardiac management. Are you able to sort of just touch on those discoveries about information and learning?
Yeah, sure. So the first one about Raynaud's disease and fish oil, this is related to, and I kind of alluded to the fact that like people have been thinking about ways of kind of connecting papers over time, and kind of using sort of computational methods to comb through the literature. So one of the first papers to do this was by this information scientist by the name of Ron Swanson, and it was this paper with a delightful title called "Undiscovered Public Knowledge." And basically, the way he discussed it was, he said, kind of posed this thought experiment. He said, imagine somewhere in the scientific literature, there's a paper that says A implies B. And then somewhere else in the literature, maybe in the same field, maybe in an entirely different field, there's another paper that says B implies C. Now, it could be true if you combine both papers that A would imply C. But because the literature is so vast, no one has actually read both these papers. And so therefore, this knowledge is kind of undiscovered public knowledge. It's kind of just lying out there, but no one knows this. The cool thing about this paper, about Swanson's paper, was he didn't just leave this as a thought experiment. He decided, okay, I'm actually going to test this. Now, this was the mid-1980s, so there were not a lot of sophisticated search techniques, but I think he just used keyword terms in, I think, the Medline database. And he ended up finding some interesting discoveries. And in this case, I think he found a relationship between Raynaud's disease, which if I recall correctly, is like related to it's like a circulatory disorder. And he found that if you would consume fish oil, it actually could help with this condition. And I believe he published it in a medical journal, even though he had no medical background. I think he did this a number of times, where he made a number of different discoveries or kind of hypotheses. But it was this kind of astounding proof of concept of saying there is this undiscovered public knowledge. There's just stuff out there that's kind of hidden in plain sight that we don't know, and hopefully using computers, we can actually kind of help uncover these things. The second example is another one of these, like kind of uncovering hidden knowledge. In this case, it involves kind of uncovering old knowledge and kind of the value of finding old information from one field and kind of using that for making new discoveries. So in this case, my father was studying non-invasive measurement around ALS, and he began thinking about, okay, as a dermatologist, maybe there's something around related to skin. And so he began searching, and he found a book from like the late 19th century that discussed, it kind of made this, someone just noticed, they're like, oh, ALS patients, they don't develop bed sores, even though they become like entirely immobile, but they don't develop bed sores. And so there's clearly something interesting going on with the skin. And so he began studying this and kind of looking at it. There were a number of papers kind of noting certain things. And he realized that I guess there was that patients with ALS had a different sort of skin elasticity. And that could actually be used as a sort of non-invasive measurement. But it only kind of was found because my father found this like book from the 19th century that ended up being relevant. And so going back to like hidden knowledge, like there's a lot, and whether it's connecting to modern papers, connecting new papers to old papers, there's lots of different ways of doing this. And so in the third example with streptokinase and cardiac management is around kind of connecting papers over time to kind of make advances more rapid than you might otherwise be able to make them. And so the idea behind this was, so streptokinases, I think they help treat heart attacks and like certain cardiac conditions. And there was a big paper in I think the late 1980s, a big study done that kind of showed like definitively this is very relevant. And so these researchers, though, they did what was called so there's a common thing of like a meta-analysis. You take all the papers from around a certain topic and then kind of try to combine all their data together and see if you can kind of learn something you might not have otherwise learned. In this case, what they did was they took all the papers that had studied streptokinases and cardiac disease and cardiac management, but they then did it kind of in this cumulative way. And they said, okay, let's look at the first paper in the early 1970s or 60s or whatever it was. Or I think actually they might have started in the 50s, and then see whether or not we can use that paper to find a relationship. And it didn't find one. Then they take the second paper, combine it with the first paper, and use that kind of additional information to see if then they could find a relationship. And they keep on doing this until they found some sort of statistically meaningful relationship. And they found that I believe 15 years earlier than the actual kind of like landmark study, you would have actually been able to know if you had just been combining the papers up until that point. And so I think rather than 1987 or 1988 or whatever it was, like they found it in like the early 70s, which is kind of astonishing that that this knowledge was just out there, and it could have been kind of ratcheted in increasing power until you actually learn something, and potentially maybe it could have saved people's lives, but because we didn't know this, it was just out there in the literature.
Now, the hard thing about this, coming particularly from the medical community, is such that facts are fluid, is almost counterintuitive. And how do you almost prepare professionals in every field for this concept?
That's a really good question. And I think, it's an open question, I will say too. I don't have all the answers. I would say certainly we have to kind of inculcate, I think at a very young age, to not just rely on all the knowledge that we kind of half remember in our heads, because oftentimes that's out of date. And we have to like be okay, like looking things up and not relying on how many billions of people that there are on the planet that we learned when we were in elementary school, because chances are good, unless you're like in middle school, it's probably changed. And it's probably changed quite a bit. And so I think we just need to be much more upfront about kind of recognizing these kinds of things are changing. But we also need to change our mindset to kind of how we think about overturning knowledge. Because, and I mentioned, going back to Isaac Asimov and his quote, it should not be a cause for concern. As things are overturned, we are learning more and more. But we need to recognize this is just the way of the world. And so I was having a conversation with a professor of mine from graduate school, and he told me this wonderful story where he had come in on a Tuesday. He was teaching a class on a Tuesday, gave some lecture. I think it was like something related to theoretical ecology. And then the next day, he actually read a paper that invalidated everything he had learned, or that like invalidated the lecture of the day before. So he came in on Thursday, the next time he had class, and he said, "Remember what I taught you on Tuesday? It's wrong. And if that bothers you, you need to get out of science." And so he was like trying to really let people know, like, this is the way science operates. Like, science is constantly in this draft form. Now, of course, it's a lot easier to say that in the abstract when it's just kind of like scientific knowledge. Now, if it is your own discoveries that are being overturned, chances are good that the scientists are going to be fighting tooth and nail to not have those things be overturned. But by and large, I think this kind of scientific mindset that hopefully like a decent number of scientists kind of have internalized should be recognized, not just for scientists, but like this is the way, like we have to recognize all knowledge. It's all in this kind of draft form. And I think ultimately, like when we think about science, we think about it as a body of knowledge, and it's not. And science produces knowledge, but science is really a rigorous means of querying the world. And as long as we recognize that, like, there are rules to how we operate, there are things that are being overturned, but we're not going to be science is not being invalidated. Science is the process by which we learn more and more. And maybe it'll overturn certain things that we thought were true, but that's okay because we're constantly learning more and more. It's easier said than done. It is a very hard thing that we need to kind of teach people about. But hopefully we can do that. Then you can actually embrace the fact that that there's changing knowledge. And I think partly this is also one of the things, and maybe I would say with the pandemic, I think people are recognizing that science is a very human endeavor. And I think we shouldn't be worried by that. Like everything is a human endeavor. It's all humans doing things. And like, the reason why scientists work at the frontier, it's where we know the least. Like that's where the most exciting things are happening. And of course, there's going to be a certain amount of flux there. And that's okay. So I think kind of recognizing the way that knowledge changes and overturn and kind of develops, it's a human process. It's always in a draft form, but the means with which we learn is like that is the thing that we should care about, less about these specific bits and pieces of knowledge that are changing along the way.
To head towards a closing thought, that anecdote with the professor being able to tell the students, forget everything I taught on Tuesday, that's one thing, because there's a relationship of authority there. He can do that or she can do that. We'd like to ask for a final comment or thought for GPs, our core audience of this podcast, and a gem, a nugget from our guest. So I might phrase it this way. Samuel, with all your research, the books, the articles you've written, what advice do you have for GPs who don't have that power of authority over their patients, but who have to live with this knowledge that something they might have said to a patient a few years ago, they now need to change?
That's a really good question. Like we all want to be right. And oftentimes when we want to be right, like we don't want that feeling of rightness to change. Like, and there's a great book called Being Wrong, if I'm remembering correctly. And in it, or at least I don't know if it's in the book or one of the things that the author always speaks about is like, what is it? And what is the feeling of being wrong? Like it actually, like being wrong feels exactly the same as being right until you're told that you're wrong. And then you're like, oh, like then there's kind of this cognitive problem. Like, oh, wait a second, what I actually thought was correct is actually wrong. And so it's a very difficult kind of thing. But I think ultimately a lot of this comes down to intellectual humility and like and both this book and my other book, Overcomplicated, I like to think a lot about kind of like humility in the face of large systems, whether it's just increasing knowledge, just humility in the face of kind of technology. And I think physicians also need to recognize, and maybe it's harder. I know a lot of physicians that talk about like the God complex and things like that. Yeah. It's hard to be humble sometimes, but we really need to recognize that because no one knows everything. Most people know a lot of things that are wrong, and that's okay. As long as we are constantly doing our best, like recognizing that we are imperfect humans with knowledge that is changing. I think the more we're aware of the processes behind changing knowledge, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. You can better adapt to it. You can kind of better handle it. Whether or not you're still going to succumb to changing knowledge, that's a certainty because things are changing. And of course, you're not necessarily going to have the most recent information. Maybe the newest fact has not kind of come to you, and that's fine. But kind of understanding that this is the way of knowledge, I think, is a very powerful and humbling approach. And so I would recommend a certain dose of humility. Maybe it's a very small dose that can be imbibed, but yeah, certainly I would say it's a humility and understanding in the face of changing knowledge. I think will allow people to recognize, yeah, this is just the way of the world. And you do the best you can, and certainly you don't want to like use this as an excuse for like abdicating responsibility, but it's okay to be constantly learning and which is what we should be doing.
Yeah. Perhaps as a strategy for a really stubborn patient who doesn't want to accept this, a doctor could perhaps prescribe that they read The Half-Life of Facts. Samuel, look, thank you for this. I've got, apart from reading your book and heartily recommending it, Being Wrong, I'm going to look up, and also that Isaac Asimov trilogy you mentioned at the beginning. That's going to be it is now on my reading list already.
Oh, fantastic.
Samuel Arbesman, thank you so much for joining This Medical Life.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenshut. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.